Mic check, yes.
All good?
Try.
Go. Good morning. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from warm. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in the world from a still warm Windhoek, Namibia.
Greetings to all our viewers across the world, and welcome to this session coming to you live from the very conference venue where exactly 30 years ago the world descended here under the auspices of Unesco, where a very historic seminar was held, giving birth, of course, to the Windhoek Declaration. Gwen, you were very much involved in that process, but yes, it's the same venue where you were that time. Yes.
That was a very special day.
It was a special day, particularly also the fact that you were co-chairperson of that seminar that gave eventual birth to the Windhoek Declaration. So what memories do you have of that?
Well, there are a lot of very good memories and a lot of energy that happened right after the adoption of the Windhoek Declaration, which was shortly after Namibian independence. And also it was a new phase of development across Africa for the media. Yes. So I think that really spurred things into action for free, independent and pluralistic media across the continent.
Indeed. Now, let me introduce the lady on my left. It's Gwen Lister, a very well-known and veteran journalist, of course, from Namibia and across the world. It's a whole household name. So it's a pleasure, Gwen, to be with you today.
You too, Toivo, and to introduce you as well to our viewers, Toivo Njabela, editor of the Namibian Sun, here in Windhoek.
Indeed. So we are here for the first plenary of the day, which is focusing on media viability, one of three main issues explored by this conference under the overall topic, information as a public good.
Yep, this is our first plenary, but I think up to date we've watched so many interesting sessions. Yes. And the feedback has been very positive.
Indeed, Gwen. Now, I mean, yesterday, for example, there was it was the Coalition's Day of the event, and we should thank everyone on behalf of the government of Namibia, of course, and UNESCO, who are the co-organizers of this event. And thanks to many partners that invested their time and energy in making so many possible, this event possible, especially those sessions.
Exactly, and between yesterday and today, there have also been 6 regional forums, and those have been very fascinating to listen to as well.
Yes, interesting discussions at the conference. And of course, it's a hybrid event, Gwen. Some of our colleagues are seated with us here
right.
in flesh, and a lot of them, the majority of them are online because, of course, partially of the COVID-19 restrictions. But we are very happy that they've been able to stream in.
Exactly. Well, I think it would have been great if everybody could have been here in person, but
yes.
We'll leave that till the post-COVID era. But in the meantime, everybody, please continue this conversation on social media under the hashtag World Press Freedom Day. And of course, you can still register for the conference, which still continues until the 3rd, with 40 more sessions and at least 350 speakers to go.
Yeah. And all the content is also available on different platforms such as VOD, interesting special videos such as World Press Freedom Voices, and the virtual movie theater. So the content is available on all those platforms for those willing to belatedly get hold of them.
Exactly. And again, please follow the hashtag World Press Freedom Day, because it gives everybody an opportunity who are not here personally to catch up on some of the important discussions.
Yes, yes. Now, without further ado, let's go to the topic of this plenary, media viability, a pillar for information as public good.
Yes, of course, there's so many pre-existing challenges to the viability of news and, of course, good journalism that have significantly worsened over time. So it's going to be fascinating to hear our panelists on this subject.
Indeed. More so now that so many media houses are cutting back, even closing some of them, and I mean, some of them have closed down. The journalists have, a lot of them have lost their jobs. So diversity of media sources has been drastically reduced, and we hope a conversation like this can help find solutions to some of those challenges.
Exactly. And to start out, we've got an introductory dialogue between Zukiswa Potye, CEO of the South African Media Development and Diversity Agency, and Rod Sims, who is from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission Chairperson, ACCC.
This important session will be moderated by Professor Guy Berger. He's from Unesco. He will introduce the topic, as this has been pre-recorded, of course, asking to please play this contribution. So, I mean, I'm asking now the technical colleagues to to roll the tape.
Roll it.
Roll the tape.
Hello, dear participants. This is the UNESCO Global World Press Freedom Day Conference. Our theme is information as a public good. But today we see that key providers of this kind of public information, the news media, are in serious economic trouble. They've seen a decade of incremental erosion of advertising revenues. And there's been more than a decade of the making of money out of news by institutions other than those who carry the costs of doing the journalism. The pandemic has brought these economic strains to a head.
Thank you for having me on this important day, the World Press Freedom Day. The Media Development and Diversity Agency in South Africa mainly gets its funding from the commercial broadcasters through a legislative process whereby these licensees pay 0.2% of their annual turnover towards the Universal Services and Access Fund levy. That funding constitutes about 64% of our total budget. Just over 30% is an annual grant from government and another 4% from interest on investments. The big print media houses stopped financially supporting the MDDA in 2014, citing financial constraints amongst others. As a result, we may have to revisit a provision in the Act we have never implemented, whereby small commercial media had to have been primarily funded from low-cost interest loans. This we've never done before, because there's just so much to consider. We must consider if these small media entities can afford this and who can offer them affordably. So this is another area to explore in terms of the sources of funding. Another area we have not explored that is also provided for in our Act is foreign donations. And we are looking at knocking at those doors very soon. The MDDA is geared towards developing the community and small commercial media, owned, managed, and controlled by previously disadvantaged groups and indigenous cultural groups that encourage the use of indigenous languages. The people of South Africa must receive information, news, and content in the languages they speak and understand. We do this by dispersing grants to qualifying startup and existing community and small commercial media that are struggling to sustain. To date, South Africa has over 270 licensed community radio stations, over 5 community televisions, and over more than 200 independent publishers from almost nothing pre-democracy. We have supported over 160 community radios, 4 televisions, and over 100 of publishers. What we are experiencing are high levels of unsustainability by the sectors we support due to lack of advertising and insufficient funding. We fund just about 25% of the total applications we get at a time due to lack of resources. Most of the beneficiaries have been funded more than once, twice, and up to 5 times owing to this lack of sustainability. And Prof, you would know because you were there with us last August, where we held a virtual consultative conference with the sector to discuss and agree on the terms of research for sustainability. That project is slow because of the stringent procurement process, but we are still hoping to conclude the research in this calendar year. The sustainability model is aimed at assisting the organization, which is the MDDA, to understand the extent and nature of this unsustainability, ascertain what resources are needed, mobilize and deploy this in terms of the needs of the sector. Thank you.
Thank you. That's extremely interesting. So it's a question of trying to sustain small media and at the same time trying to sustain the MDA and grow the MDDA. Just quickly to give us a sense, you said that you support 25% of the applications you get. About how many is that a year? How many media outlets are you able to support a year? Is it 10,
only
20?
About 20. So in a year, we only are able to support about 20 qualifying applications from the community broadcasters. It is even more constrained in the print, where we lost financial support from the commercial media houses, where we only can fund between 6 and 8. And we receive about more than 160 applications at a time from the independent publishers, and we can only support about 6. And even that, those are not big amounts, Prof, because we only support them for about 300, 400,000 per entity, because the budget there is just about 2 million per annum. Thank you.
Okay. And it's, as I understand, then the broadcasters, it's a statutory levy on them. The print, it was a voluntary contribution, and then they stopped making that contribution, you said. And at the
Correct.
moment, from internet companies, there's no contributions. Now,
Certainly
that brings us to Rod Sims, the head of the Australian Competition Commission. Thanks, Rod, for being here.
What we came up with that's of particular relevance here in the media was to come up with a media bargaining code. We recognise that the media companies were providing a lot of valuable content to both Google and Facebook, but Google and Facebook had such market power that there was no way they could effectively negotiate a commercial deal for the value they provide to Google and Facebook. So we recommended a code which started off voluntary, became mandatory. The essence of the code is 2 things. 1, a negotiate arbitrate model. So you negotiate, but if that doesn't succeed, there's arbitration. And that's what we do in infrastructure a lot. That's a well-established infrastructure model in Australia. So we just picked that up and applied it to media. And secondly, Google and Facebook have to do that with all eligible media companies. They can't pick and choose. And so that has facilitated commercial deals, which are now happening. 3 of our 4 major media companies have got a deal. I think half of our second-tier companies have got a deal, and quite a lot of our smaller companies have got a deal. But progressively, I think they'll all get commercial deals, which so far the media companies are very happy with. So it is a good way of funding journalism, but it's funding it by recognising the value that journalism creates for digital platforms and setting up a framework for fair commercial negotiations, which without the ability to go to arbitration, you just could not have. You can't have a fair negotiation with a monopoly. It just doesn't happen in any field of endeavour.
This is really about creating more of an equal playing field in terms of 2 sectors, I guess. And I want to ask you a sort of follow-up question to that, which is that you have this bilateral framework for negotiation between those who are making a lot of money and those who need the money to keep on producing journalism. That sounds very interesting. And your funds, the funds that flow, don't go through the state as such. Is there a danger, though, that the bigger media fish can bargain more strongly and benefit disproportionately, and that the small players, the startups, get left out because they are not recognized as part of the bargaining system?
Not at all. Absolutely not. I have to be very clear on that. And let me just say a few things about that. First of all, our system allows collective bargaining. So we automatically allow media companies to get together and bargain collectively. The best example of that will be an organisation called Country Press Australia, which is the representative body of about 160 publications throughout regional Australia who are definitely suffering, and they will negotiate collectively and they will be successful, and so they'll get at least their proportion of money. And some of the small, we've got quite small players here who on their own have negotiated a deal with Facebook and Google. So it's just often asserted, but completely wrong, that the smaller players don't benefit. If you want to support over and above that, as we do in Australia, and what we recommended, regional journalism, particularly local court reporting, local health reporting, local education reporting, that we recommended be funded by the government, and the government is doing a bit of that. The government also funds the National Newswire service, so that helps as well. And of course, in Australia, we have 2 public broadcasters who are funded by well over $1 billion a year. So we have the state supports journalism through public broadcasting, through money for areas that they think need it, and through the National Newswire service. So the code is one of a suite of measures, never meant to be the only solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for explaining that. That's extremely interesting. Zukiswa, I'll come back to you to ask you a question, because the contrast between the MDDA and this Australian model is that the funds with the MDDA, they come through the state. It's not a direct bilateral transfer, as it were, or negotiation. There is a fear, of course, that if a state body controls the funds, it could become politicized, and that only sweetheart media could get support. So how does MDDA, how is it structured to avoid this kind of situation where MDDA could be captured and leveraged for political bias, I suppose?
Thank you, Guy. Look, this is an area that you cannot say that you've got complete full control over. However, the MDDA is a juristic person in terms of its 2002 Act. It is independent, it is impartial, and exercises its powers and duties without fear or prejudice, political or commercial interference. The MDDA is controlled by a board and has a government only as a shareholder. The government signs a governance agreement with the board annually to regulate that relationship. So all core business of the MDDA as an entity are delegated to the board, assisted by the executive management, and we account to the shareholder and parliament on the implementation of our mandate. We are talking to, for an example of what we're dealing with here is that we're talking to local spheres of government, because this is where our community media are, to assist community and small commercial media with advertising and hopefully also cost-effective rental space where possible. And we stress the importance whenever we engage with these spheres of government about possible assistance or support to our projects. We stress the importance of assisting the media without interfering in the editorial content.
And in terms of transparency, which is also part of the guardrails to show that you are autonomous, how transparent is the MDDA? Can people see who gets money on what basis?
Oh, yes, certainly. Firstly, the criteria to apply is in our regulations. The regulations are a public document, Guy. And secondly, we've got a policy. Obviously, it's known to us, but what we did was we canvassed it with the sector itself. And what we've also done, Guy, is in 2019, we decided to do away with the backlog of applications that was dating back 10 years before, 10 years prior. And that was creating challenges on how do we account transparently on who we have funded and why. If there's an application lying dormant from 2010 or 2008, and you then find a compliant application that was submitted in 2018, from then, we then introduced an annual call, and we don't hold applications over. Whether you were compliant, but we were limited in funding you, and we will write back to you to say you were compliant and encourage you to reapply. So we have done away with that so that there's more transparency, but also the list of projects that have been approved goes onto our website, and it must be published on the annual report as a legislative requirement.
Okay, thanks for that. That's great. We need to wrap up now because there's going to be some further discussions on this topic coming up shortly. So let me ask you each in about 1 minute, what's the #1 lesson that your national experience could have for media viability in other countries? Shall we take you first, Rod?
Yes, indeed. I would say that remove obstacles to journalism first, and that's what the code is about, an obstacle being not getting paid for the value of your content through the digital platforms. And once you've done that, there is a very strong role for government funding of journalism, making sure that you set up mechanisms to maintain independence. So the public broadcaster in Australia has a charter that guarantees its independence, and the funding that's set up should be done as much as possible at arm's length.
Thank you. And Zukiswa, #1 lesson for other countries from MDDA's experience?
From our point of view, Guy, I think governments must support the media and journalism through relevant resources, including grants like South African government is doing. They must, however, always be conscious that these platforms must remain independent and without interference. I must say, though, that South Africa does not struggle a lot with such matters because we are known for having organizations that safeguard press freedom, including an active, very active civil society organizations in South Africa. I must, Guy and Rod, also boast that South Africa is known for its constitution that guarantees the freedom of the press and that of the media, including the right to access to information. And I think that the South African government does not take this for granted. For where it fails, the media watchdogs are always ready to act.
Okay, well, thank you both for sharing your experiences. I think this really gave us insight into some positive measures that states can take vis-a-vis the viability of the media. And I'm sure both of you continue to monitor how effective you are, and if need be, you will keep on developing new strategies, new approaches to ensure that in the end, we have a strong media and that media can give us information as a public good. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
A very innovative and promising conversation there, Gwen, between Professor Guy Berger of Unesco with Zukiswa, Potye, and Rod Sims there. I think especially now that the media space is evolving from the legacy space into these innovations, I thought it was quite interesting and promising, especially for those of us that are in this industry.
Fascinating, and also interesting to think that in Windhoek in 1991, the main conversation was about the viability of independent print media. And 30 years later, we're talking about viability basically across the entire media spectrum. No silver bullet, as we know, but lots of ideas. So please, if you have any, go to the hashtag World Press Freedom Day and put your ideas down there.
Now, Gwen, we have another short video contribution before we go to our live panel. Who do we have?
This time we've got Ambassador Anna Brandt, who is chair of the UNESCO International Programme for the Development of Communication, IPDC, which has done a lot for media development since Windhoek 1991. Let's roll that tape.
When there's no free independent news media producing quality journalism, citizens lack the primary source of credible information needed to make informed decisions. Back in 1991, the original historic Windhoek Declaration made a call to UNESCO's International Programme for the Development of Communication, the IPDC, which is a body that the UNESCO member states have given me the honour to chair. The original Windhoek call was for IPDC to initiate research on legal and economic barriers to the establishment of news media outlets. We did that. And 30 years later, many of these initial barriers have diminished. But new challenges to sustainability of free, independent, and pluralistic media have emerged. Even before the pandemic, countless communities were still struggling in news deserts. Today, we risk losing much of even what does exist. So, while the world works to build back better in the post-COVID era, it is mission critical to this enterprise to also build back and improve media viability. The intensifying trajectory of decline, rather than growth, has given rise to many initiatives to find ways to pay for journalism while also protecting editorial integrity. For our part, IPDC is rising to the challenge by supporting a focused push at UNESCO, as we announced at our 40th anniversary celebrations last November. This initiative, in partnership with the World News Publishers Association, begins with research led by the Economist Intelligence Unit and drawing on the IPDC's draft media viability indicators. The research results will help us understand trends in media viability, both globally and specifically in 10 developing countries. The research will also feed into knowledge exchanges and wider consultations in these countries, these 10 countries, organized by the NGO Free Press Unlimited. These experiences will help identify best practices and innovations for an IPDC handbook of case studies on viability. Then, working with leading experts from the International Center for Journalists and Columbia University, UNESCO will build on all this to develop concrete policy recommendations for member states and other stakeholders to make a real difference. The knowledge gained throughout this initiative will inform the next global edition of UNESCO's World Trends in Freedom of Expression and Media Development, which will be released at UNESCO's General Conference this fall, with a special focus on the theme of journalism as a public good. Sweden has been a strong supporter of the World Trends Report since its inception and looks forward to this next edition as an important contribution to our global discussions on media viability. The whole initiative is being done in conversation with parallel work around the world in order to share lessons and combine forces. History tells us that media viability without press freedom does not deliver independent journalism. On the other hand, press freedom without media viability risks being just an empty shell. We need both. We need press freedom and media viability. And we need to make society aware of what's needed to ensure that there is a strong future for free, independent, and sustainable journalism. This is why our deliberations here today are key to taking forward what has become a critical issue for our times. I thank you for your attention.
That was Ambassador Anna Brandt, I think, giving a very important message there, especially on the interlinkages between media viability and how press freedom can be sustained also as a result of that viability. Gwen, we now are readying ourselves for the live panel. Who do we have?
Yes. Well, that was fascinating also to know that important connection between press freedom and good journalism and viability of media. It's sort of the one can't do without the other. But we have this panel coming up, and I'm sure there are going to be great ideas emanating from this. So without further ado, we're going to be handing over to Mira Milosevic of the Global Forum for Media Development, who is going to take us through with her very good panelists on this subject. So I hope there'll be great ideas coming from that.
Over to you, Mira.
Good afternoon and good evening to all our panelists and participants joining us from around the world. Thank you, Toivo. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you also to Ambassador Brandt for insightful comments and warm welcome. As we have heard from Zukiswa, Potye and Rod Sims, we are seeing some promising ideas and movements in both market regulation and overall public policy, with the goal to address challenges in political, technological, social, and business environment that have compromised sustainability, but also the independence of journalism and news media globally. With the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, amplifying the crisis, we see that the coming years will be decisive for the future of journalism. We hope that this conversation today will shed light on some of the most burning problems for both big and small media and journalism outlets, while primarily discussing options for enhanced support and much needed new policies and regulatory approaches. Joining us today to discuss these challenges and some of their solutions are Warren Fernandez, Chair of the World Editors Forum, Beth Costa, General Secretary of the Brazilian National Federation of Journalists, Kiran Maharaj, President of the Media Institute of the Caribbean, Christophe Deloire, Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders, and Sheetal, Vyas, Executive Director at the International Fund for Public Interest Media. We have, I think, less than 45 minutes for this conversation, and this is a group of fantastic speakers, but I will have to ask all of you to be as concise as possible and keep your responses to no more than 3 minutes. So let's start. Let's go to Singapore first. Warren Fernandez is an editor-in-chief of the Straits Times and Singapore Press Holdings Media Group. But Warren, you're here as chair of World Editors Forum at WANIFRA, that is a global network that gathers national publishers associations, representing more than 15,000 news publishers. And of course, numerous editors that you represent from over 120 countries. How has the pandemic impacted your members, their audiences, and their revenues? Have many of your members had to close their operations, and are many at risk of closing down and leaving their communities without supporting sources?
All of you at home, all around the world from Singapore. I'm speaking to you from my newsroom here in Singapore. Well, as you know, COVID-19 has been both a boon and a bane for the media. I say boon because we've seen our audiences grow phenomenally. People are coming to us hungry for information, hungry for interpretation of what's going on, and trying to get information to make sense of these bewildering times. And as a result, my newspaper, for example, we've put all our content related to COVID-19 outside the paywall as a public service. And I think it also has helped enhance the understanding of the value of the information that we put out, and we've seen trust levels go up. And I think that shows to many stakeholders the important role that media organizations and professional newsrooms play, especially in a crisis like this, when public communication is so critical. But the irony is that despite rising audiences, advertising revenues have been coming down. And this has been an existential challenge for many newsrooms around the world. Just to give you an example, about a quarter of the newsrooms that were functioning in 2015 have had to shut down in the light of what has been happening in the recent past because of COVID-19. And this essentially is a challenge for all of us. So what we've been doing at the World Association of News Publishers and the World Editors Forum is firstly collaborating, finding ways in which we can help each other across newsrooms, share information, share experiences, to some extent share resources. I think that's the best way we can help each other, by working together collectively and collaboratively. Secondly, we have a whole bunch of grants which we've been giving out to help newsrooms in Africa and Southeast Asia, with the support of the Norwegian, the Swedish, and the Danish government. We've been able to give out financial support to the tune of 3 million euros. So financial support is one way. We do what we can. Obviously, this is a huge challenge, so we can't solve the entire problem, but we do what we can. We've also been partnering with Unesco. I think you heard the previous speaker mentioning some of the research that's being done to figure out the extent of this problem, to share best practices and learning so that we can all benefit from each other's experiences. And then thirdly, we're trying to work together on capacity building. So the World Editors Forum, for example, we're working with a foundation in Singapore called Temasek to run programs, fellowships, one of which is called the Science in Newsrooms Fellowship, to help skill up and train science journalists who can then cover the COVID-19 pandemic authoritatively and address the needs of our audience. So those are a range of ways in which we've been trying to help newsrooms across the world.
Experiences of Singapore later, but now let's go to Caribbean. Kiran, Maharaj is the managing director of Caribbean Lifestyle Communications Media Network and president of the Media Institute of the Caribbean. Warren gave us a view of the situation around the world. What are the most pressing problems of the media ecosystem in the Caribbean, especially in the context of climate change, natural disasters, and now the pandemic that we are all facing?
Good morning, and thank you for having me here this morning. It's very peculiar for us. You have to remember that you're dealing with a lot of countries that are small islands. So we have very small populations ranging from 90,000 to maybe 2.5 million in the English-speaking region. And one of the things is that obviously means we have small economies. So when the advertising gets cut, it affects us severely. In fact, some of our countries don't even have a daily newspaper. We do a lot of our reporting online. They are one-person news platforms online. And in a recent study that we did at the Media Institute of the Caribbean, did through a small grant from IPDC, we found that 54% of journalists who responded in that survey said they had to look for additional employment because they were either let go from the newsrooms, or what happened was that they were reduced. Their work hours and the number of beats that they covered, that was reduced. You're also looking at a situation where freedom of information and access to information is not something that we are allowed. It's not something that's guaranteed. In fact, in the Pan-Caribbean region, there are only 6 countries who have such legislation. And even when the media here has made applications for information, we get very, very long delays, or we do not get the information at all. So from an investigative journalism standpoint, it puts a lot of pressure on us. And so there is a real threat of media capture. There is also a threat to independent journalism, and it's something that we have to deal with daily. we've started to deal with it through the development of cross-border collaboration. And that's one of the key things that Media Institute of the Caribbean does, because we have an investigative journalism online multimedia platform, which is the Caribbean Investigative Journalism Network. It's relatively new. But that's one of the things that we've been trying to do. And similarly to what Warren does, we're trying to build capacity throughout the region. We also have the issue too of government-owned, state-owned media. We don't have public broadcasting the way that many other countries do, especially in the developed world. So you don't have public contributions. You don't have as many contributions by corporates and foundations. What you have is the government has their own media outlets and platforms, and they tend to obviously support those more. And they are in competition with private media. So you'll find that there are things like rate slashing in the advertising world that we have to deal with. It comes from the government. So those are just some of the things. As far as the threats of natural disaster, that is an existential threat for us. St. Vincent the Grenadines just had a volcanic eruption yesterday. There was flooding. But when you think of an island like that, where the population is just about 110,000, and they had to evacuate 20,000 people, almost immediately, that's about 1/5 of the population. You realize that there can be not just the loss of lives, but obviously the loss of livelihoods is something that is very real. And we've had bad hurricane seasons, and all of this ties back into the climate change that we are facing. So the hurricanes, 80% of roofs and homes were lost in Dominica. We have Kickham Jenny in Grenada, which is an underground volcano. We have so many issues at hand that we're trying to deal with. And so when our newsrooms get cut back and there's a loss of jobs there, obviously this information cannot get out. And when you look at that, coupled with the fact that we cannot freely access the data and information from governments, it makes it a little bit worse for us. So we are dealing with a lot of issues in our region, but by trying to come together and work collectively and support our journalists through entities like the Media Institute, working with local media associations, we think we will be able to get somewhere.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Kiran. And it's obvious from what we've heard from Warren and Kiran that the situation is dramatic, both in terms of media and journalism survival. We see that, of course, around the world, audiences and citizens are facing survival situations. And, of course, finally, it's impacting journalists themselves. And what we heard from Kiran is a really great segue. She said that 54% of journalists had to look for additional employment. International Federation of Journalists did a survey last year, and they came up with the data point that 2/3 of all journalists worldwide have suffered from impact of COVID in one way or another. So they lost jobs, they lost commissions, their pay was decreased, etc. We have with us today Beth Costa. Beth, you're the former Secretary General of the International Federation of Journalists, and now General Secretary of the National Federation of Journalists in Brazil. Last October, the National Federation of Journalists proposed a new tax on digital platforms and the creation of a fund to support and promote journalists and journalism. And as we heard, similar approaches are being considered in the US, UK, France, and in Australia, where the bargaining code has been adopted. And we just heard Rod Sims talk about first results. Beth, can you tell us more about the Brazilian proposal? How are you envisaging that it ensures that individual deals between big media groups and tech platforms don't happen, but that it genuinely supports small local nonprofit journalism operations and journalists, and also takes into consideration minority and indigenous communities and their information needs?
Well, your question just approached the big challenges we have with this proposal. So FENAJ is the Brazilian branch of the IFJ. We replied to the call of IFJ for this challenge to find a way, national ways in many countries of the world to cope with this taxation of big platforms. I don't know if you know, but in Brazil, media system was born public, but through the years they became private. So the main media houses in Brazil, we have very low, and now our government is trying to distract the only public enterprise we have here. They are cutting money and trying to privatize also the system of public media that we had here. So our media in Brazil is private. And of course, as you said, through the years, they closed their doors, they dismissed journalists, and they lost revenues because of the work of the big tech platforms. What we are trying to do in Brazil, in a very aggressive environment against journalists and workers, is that to try to build a project of law that could taxation of the big tax, but it's not a tax that goes to the government, because our constitution allows us to have a contribution on many economical fields, and we know that information and the big techs are one of the big economical fields in Brazil. It's a contribution with the seal that's a very clear destination. It goes to a fund to promote journalism and to support journalists. So this fund, there will be a board. What we want to guarantee is the transparency of the revenue and the distribution, as our colleagues from South Africa told some very good example. But the board must have the presence of workers. IFJ, we always say that journalists are in the post of producing the news, so they must be part of this any taxation, any proposal. Journalists and their organizations must be part of this process, but must be part of the dialogue. And this in Brazil is very difficult now, because I don't need to explain. We are facing a very, very cruel crisis on politics, social, and also political and sanitary conditions. So we are trying to build a project of law with a contribution that goes direct to a fund that will be administrated, ruled by, we are still thinking of it. How are the groups that will be part of this board for the fund? But we know that civil society, media houses, media owners, maybe some part of the government, and for sure the representative of the unions must be there. And but to get access to that fund, the media houses must cope to some criteria. Cannot be media houses that are part of monopolies. They must assure job conditions. They must assure gender equality, fair play, job protection, not dismissal, and ethical standards for plurality and diversity of sources. And of course, in Brazil, we are a continental country. We also want to improve and cope to this news desert, because in Brazil we have some survey that goes to 2020 August, that 62% of the cities in Brazil are not covered by media houses or news sources. 62%, they don't have local or regional coverage from news. So this fund will cope to promote local and regional news, of course, taking into account, as you said, all the cultural diversity of this country from north to south.
Yes. Thank you so much, Beth. That was really interesting, especially this new research that you quoted about news deserts in Brazil. That's quite a stark figure. Speaking about ideas and possible solutions, and of course, different arguments from different sides for and against some of them, there was an earlier session in this World Press Freedom Day conference previewing a report that is being produced by the Information and Democracy Forum and its working group on the sustainability of journalism. Christophe Deloire is the chair of Information and Democracy Forum and, of course, Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders. Christophe, good afternoon to you, and could you tell us about the main recommendations of this forthcoming report? What should states, private sector, and international organizations do to enable the production, distribution, and survival of journalism as a public good?
Thank you, and hello, Mira. And I will start by saying that I would have loved to be in Namibia, because the country is ranked 24 in the World Press Freedom Index, published last week by Reporters Without Borders. To answer your question, you may remember that when we initiated the Initiative on Information Democracy with a declaration, which was a civil society-based declaration, which was drafted by a commission of 25 prominent figures from 19 countries, 19 nationalities, we defined journalism as trusted third party for societies. According to their rights and duties, this is what they are supposed to be. And this function, this is what we said in this declaration, justifies a specific effort by societies to ensure its sustainability. The question is that this effort, which existed, of course, in many countries for years, in many democracies, has to be renewed. To be renewed because the crisis is stronger, but also because there is such a change of paradigm. And this effort has to be redefined. And this is why we have launched the working group of the Forum on Information Democracy on the question, on the issue of the sustainability of journalism. Its steering committee is chaired by Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, who is the head of the Reuters Institute, and is composed of international thinkers and practitioners of journalism from all around the world. It focuses on providing concrete recommendations for public policy and off-market solutions. According to a Reuters Institute survey, financial aid is quoted as the most important solution by 65% of respondents. But developing resources and stimulating demand are, of course, among the topics covered by the report we will publish soon in the next few weeks in June. But our work goes further. It offers concrete solutions to create an enabling environment for journalism and endeavors to identify avenues to enable the press, which is struggling to adjust to the new digital space, to navigate through the technological disruptions of tomorrow. And all dimensions of the equation must be taken into account to ensure the sustainability of this essential social function of journalism. So we are working. Of course, the recommendations, the set of recommendations will include direct and indirect support, the creation of how to incentivize support for non-profit news media, how can you increase part of overseas development assistance budgets to support public interest journalism, other more structural recommendations, such as ensuring the digital markets are competitive, examine the interplay of privacy, digital ad market, social media, and related fields, etc., etc. The purpose of this working group, as of other working groups of the Forum on Information Democracy, is to offer for all countries, for all governments, very concrete recommendations. These are policy frameworks, and we have a group of prominent figures to think together with very different profiles. So we will be delighted to discuss with all of you the potential implementation of those recommendations.
Thank you so much, Christophe. This is a really good also segue to the conversation with our next panelist, and especially again, the figure that you mentioned, that 65% of news and journalism organizations are quoting financial help as the major way to help them. We have with us Sheetal Vyas, who was recently appointed as the founding executive director of a new innovative mechanism for funding journalism, the International Fund for Public Interest Media. Sheetal, could you tell us a bit more about where you are with the development of this fund? And of course, maybe give us the information that is of most interest for those who are fighting for survival today. When can we expect the first deployment of funds? Sheetal, over to you.
Thank you, Mira. Can I just start by saying thank you to UNESCO and the wider UN, including the Verified team and the Secretary General himself, for your very generous support of our initiative, the International Fund for Public Interest Media. I think it's important that we're talking about this subject on the anniversary of the Windhoek Declaration. As it was then, I think we're in a moment right now where we need to come together to ensure that public interest media finds its rightful place as a protected global public good. We've heard from a number of the speakers today, Warren and Kiran, talking about the market failure that journalism is facing. It's struggling to face itself, fund itself even, and the pandemic is making it worse. And at the same time, though, we're seeing an increasing public need for information that is trustworthy. There's lots of great work already going on to support independent media, and it's absolutely crucial that that continues. But the idea with our fund, which is ambitious, but it's needed to address the scale of the problem that we've been talking about, this market failure we've been talking about, and is different to the existing development initiatives that are in play right now, is that we want to catalyze new money, additional new money for the sector, and we want to channel it in a new way to avoid this extinction event. Right now, CIMA, the Centre for International Media Assistance, is saying that about 0.3% of development aid, overseas development aid, goes towards the media sector. And we haven't really seen that figure change in recent years, despite this market failure, despite this kind of increase in misinformation that we're seeing. The Secretary General was very generous and gave us a video message of support earlier this week for our fund. And he talked about, I quote, maintaining independent fact-based reporting as an essential global public good. And usually when public goods fail, states intervene. But we all know, we've heard today, that states funding journalism can be difficult. It can get messy, there's scope for editorial interference, it can be expensive, and it's hard to navigate, which is historically the reason why media spend has been so low. So with our fund, what we're trying to do is create a step change in the amount of financial support that's going to independent media, but we want to do that in a structure, in a governance structure that is both multilateral, so the funding is coming from multiple sources, but is also independent. And that, we think, is what creates legitimacy in the countries within which we want to operate. So you asked where we are now. We have the Secretariat established. We have funding secured for us to, and we've got that funding actually, I should say, from Luminate, the MacArthur Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, and also very recently the United States Department, National Endowment for Democracy. So with that funding that we've secured, we want to do two things. The first is we do need to fundraise. We're currently seeking to raise $100 million US from governments, from development agencies, from tech companies, from philanthropies. And that will effectively form the grant pot for our phase 1 of deployment of the fund. The second thing that we're doing right now is also the detailed design of what that phase 1 looks like. There was an excellent feasibility study that took place last year. We're building on that design to scope out phase 1. We see phase 1 as a proof of concept stage. We think it will last for 2 years. It will, the time of when it launches is unfortunately going to be dependent on how long it takes us to fundraise. So the earlier we can fundraise, the sooner we can deploy our fund. I think realistically, we think it would be towards the second half of next year, but we would love for that to be earlier. So we'd love to secure funding sooner than that. In terms of where we will operate, fundamentally we'll be working in low and middle income countries. We're working through our selection criteria right now for phase 1, but it will also be based on the need that exists within those subset of countries. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that if phase 1 is successful finally, then our vision of this program is that we will scale up our support up to $1 billion over an 8 to 10 year period, so that we can really chart this path for a viable media sector in many parts of the world.
Thank you, Sheetal, so much. We are unfortunately running out of time, so we will do a quick round with all our panelists, and I will ask you to be as brief as possible, up to 2 minutes each. Let's go back to Singapore and Warren, and maybe focus on recommendations to states, private sector, technology companies, and international organizations. What advice would you give to some of them, or maybe all of them, when it comes to, for instance, addressing those news media deserts that, for instance, Beth mentioned? 62% of municipalities in Brazil are not covered by a single professional source of information. Over to you, Warren.
Open the sound.
Yes, I don't think we can hear him.
No. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I was just saying that this discussion we're having is absolutely vital, because the whole question of news deserts goes to the heart of our democracies, because unless you have newsrooms which have the resources to go deep into issues and with the expertise to do it, we can't do our jobs. And if we can't do our jobs, our democracies can't function. And so this market failure really calls out for solutions. And we've heard some interesting ideas from the panelists. And I think if you look at what's going on around the world at the moment, we're seeing in play various experiments being undertaken. So in some newsrooms, we've had individuals coming forward, philanthropists, Jeff Bezos in the case of Washington Post, Jack Ma in the case of in Hong Kong. That, of course, has its own pros and cons, right, with an individual wielding so much power over the news organizations, because you can get capture from business groups as well. We've heard of the idea of public funding. This has been very common in the broadcast space, in radio and television, but not so much in newsrooms. Public funding can also support ethnic communities in a place like Singapore, which is multi-ethnic and multilingual. Running separate newsrooms to provide information for all the communities is extremely expensive. and a case can be made that there is a role for the state, for the public sector, to pay for some of that important information getting out into all the communities. And then I think you get into this very interesting idea which we're seeing emerge of non-profits and public service journalism being funded by not-for-profit organizations like The Guardian in the UK, or the Philadelphia Inquirer in the US, or Bertelsmann in Germany, or the Nikkei in Japan. And these are institutions which are set up with the express purpose of safeguarding credible and information and ensuring that those organizations continue. And they function commercially, and whatever profits they make are reinvested in the business of journalism. I think that's an important example of how things might go forward.
Thank you so much, Warren.
Which is, can I just make one last pitch for World News Day, which is coming up on September 28th, which is the World Editors Forum's effort to bring newsrooms from all around the world together to showcase what we do together and make the case for the important role that professional newsrooms make. So I would invite all of you around the world to please join us in that effort to help make the argument why the work that we do in newsrooms is so important for our communities.
Yes, absolutely. Key to do that. Let's go to South America, back to Beth. Just quickly, we've heard that journalists are, of course, around the world in precarious position. What is your recommendation that needs to be put in place to ensure a fair compensation for journalists and their work online? Again, briefly, please, if possible. Over to you, Beth.
Well, I think that I'm here as a representative of the trade union movement, and I will repeat it as a mantra. Any system, any taxation, any directive, any proposal for sharing funds and to improve journalism and the quality of journalism that proved today to be essential in this pandemic. Journalism became an essential public service, and a public service must have public funds, even if it goes to private sector. So any proposal must have the presence of the representative of journalists, because if journalists are not able to work with independency, with fair pay, without fear, and in a way that can produce a quality journalism, all those discussions won't go anywhere. So we say that any proposal must have into account some criteria, that is fair pay, gender equity, job protections, health protections to the professionals, even if we talk about freelancers. What we need is to have some of us. I know that trade unionists are considered as troublemakers, but we are, because we are here to defend the rights of the workers, the ones that are providing free information, quality information for civil society and providing information as a public good, independent, quality, and with fair pay.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you for keeping to time. Christophe, over to you. You mentioned the latest edition of the World Press Freedom Index, and we know that unfortunately more than 90% of world population lives in countries where level of press freedom is far away from being ideal. What are political recommendations for states and international organizations and multilateral processes that you could make? And also, how can we upscale capacity of press freedom organizations to advocate for our sector? Of course, in a couple of I don't think we can hear Christophe.
Oh.
I was simply on mute. I said, what a broad question you asked. Journalism is affected in the same time by a diversity of different crises. A geopolitical crisis, a technological crisis, a crisis of democracy, a crisis of trust, and an economic crisis of the media sector. And all those crises are amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. And all those crises could like amplify other crises. And what we, the risk is that, as you mentioned in your introduction, Mira, this could be a decisive decade for journalism. So if governments, and of course also international intergovernmental organizations and associations, NGOs, want to avoid this risk to really enter into reality, we have to connect dots that were probably not connected in the past. I mean that in the past, we had some people dealing with economical problems, other ones about professional methods and ethics, other ones about technology, infrastructure, etc. If we want to defend the social function of journalism, we have to connect dots between ethics, technology, political framework, legal framework, economy, business, etc.
Yes.
And I think this is a new logic we enter into.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you. Thank you so much. And we have just 1 minute left. I will go back to Sheetal and Kiran just quickly. A quick yes or no question, unfortunately. Do you think that all these ideas and suggestions and recommendations that we had today and that we're hearing lately are enough to prevent disappearance of journalism as public good and public interest media? First to you, Sheetal, and what would be your recommendation? And then to you, Kiran, before we close this panel.
So, Mira, very quickly, I think the answer is yes, otherwise we wouldn't be trying. As the Secretary General himself said, maintaining independent, fact-based reporting is an essential global public good, critical to building a safer, healthier and greener future. At a very practical level, I think that funding the International Fund for Public Interest Media is a route to making that future a reality.
Thank you, Sheetal. And Karen, last words for this panel, please.
We have to remember that that media really is the conscience and consciousness of society. If there's media extinction, it means the extinction of truth, the decay of democracy, and the death of sustainable societies. And I think that all of what we've learned today and the fact that we're coming together means that there is a future and that we can avoid this threat of media extinction. And I look forward to working together with the rest of the world to make it happen.
For joining us today. Gwen, Toivo, back to you to Namibia with, of course, regrets that we can't be all together with you today.
Thank you, Mira. That was fascinating, and I wish we hadn't run out of time. I would have liked to have heard more. But as always, time is one of the most unviable things that we have at this type of gathering, so I wish we had time. Toivo, what do you think?
Yeah, I thought it was a very fruitful engagement. A lot of brilliant ideas being put across there, and I'm sure we are now under pressure actually to go a long way to adopt some of these things, but a beautiful conversation.
Absolutely, and lots of ideas to be discussed out there on the hashtag World Press Freedom Day. Thank you, Mira. Thank you, everybody else, for your participation. Bye for now. Jesus,